The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone walls of castle as Princess Isabella stood at her chamber window, watching the final preparations for what many called an impossible wedding. At 23, she possessed the kind of beauty that inspired poets and the intelligence that worried diplomats. Her golden hair caught the light as she turned from the window, her emerald eyes reflecting a mixture of determination and fear that had become her constant companions over the past month. "Your Highness, the carriage is ready," announced her lady-in-waiting, whose voice trembled slightly. Everyone in the human kingdom of Astoria knew what this marriage meant. It was not born of love or political convenience, but of desperate necessity. Isabella smoothed her ivory silk gown, adorned with pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. The dress was beautiful, but it felt like armor against the unknown future that awaited her. "Tell me again what father said about the treaty terms," she requested, though she knew every word by heart. Cleared her throat nervously. King Edmund made it clear that this union with Lord Adrian, the vampire king would end the century-long war between our peoples. The treaty specifies that both kingdoms will cease all hostilities, establish trade agreements, and your marriage will seal the pact permanently. The war between humans and vampires had raged for over 100 years, claiming countless lives on both sides. Isabella's own brother, Prince William, had fallen in battle just 2 years prior, his death serving as the catalyst for her father's desperate search for peace. The vampire armies, led by the formidable Adrian, had grown stronger with each passing decade, while human resources dwindled. Isabella had only seen Adrian once, 3 months ago during the initial peace negotiations. He had arrived at the human court with an otherworldly presence that made everyone in the throne room hold their breath. Standing over 6 feet tall with jet-black hair and piercing silver eyes, he commanded attention without saying a word. His pale skin seemed to glow in the candlelight, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that resonated through the very stones of the castle. The negotiations had been tense. King Edmund, Isabella's father, sat rigidly on his throne, his graying beard unable to hide the exhaustion that years of war had carved into his face. Adrian had presented his terms with calculated precision, a marriage alliance that would bind their kingdoms together, ensuring peace through the most sacred of unions. "Why my daughter?" King Edmund had asked, his voice barely concealing his anguish. Adrian's silver eyes had found Isabella across the crowded throne room. "Because, Your Majesty, Princess Isabella represents the future of humanity. Her reputation for wisdom and compassion precedes her. Such a union would demonstrate to both our peoples that this peace is built on respect, not conquest." Isabella remembered how those words had sent chills down her spine. She had expected demands for territory or tribute, not a marriage proposal that would change the course of her entire life. Now, as she prepared to leave everything familiar behind, Isabella wondered if Adrian was capable of the gentleness that marriage required. Vampires were known for their strength, their immortality, and their need for blood to survive. The stories told in human lands painted them as monsters, though the reality had proven more complex during the years of war. The carriage ride to the border took 6 hours, winding through forests that grew darker and more ancient with each mile. Isabella's escort consisted of 50 of her father's best knights, led by Sir Thomas, who had served her family for over 20 years. His weathered face showed the concern of a man who feared he was delivering his princess to certain doom. "Your Highness," Sir Thomas said, riding alongside her carriage, "remember that King Edmund has provisions in the treaty for your protection. Should you ever be mistreated, we are bound by oath to retrieve you." Isabella nodded, though she wondered if such provisions would matter in the realm of vampires. "I understand my duty, Sir Thomas. This marriage may save thousands of lives." As they approached the border, the landscape transformed dramatically. The trees grew taller and their branches intertwined overhead, blocking out much of the daylight. Strange flowers bloomed in shades of deep purple and midnight blue, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly energy. This was the vampire kingdom that had remained mysterious to humans for centuries. At the border crossing, they were met by vampire guards mounted on black horses that seemed to move like liquid shadow. The lead guard, a tall woman with silver hair braided down her back, approached the carriage with fluid grace. "Princess Isabella of Astoria," she announced, her voice carrying a musical quality that seemed almost hypnotic. "I am Lady, advisor to King Adrian. I will escort you to palace for your wedding ceremony." The vampire palace appeared before them as they crested a hill, and Isabella gasped despite her attempts to maintain composure. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. The structure seemed to grow from the mountainside itself, its dark stone towers reaching toward the perpetually twilight sky of. Gothic spires twisted upward like frozen lightning, and windows glowed with a soft, ethereal light that suggested magic rather than simple flame. Gardens surrounded the palace, filled with night-blooming flowers that perfumed the air with intoxicating fragrances. Fountains scattered throughout the grounds created a symphony of water sounds that seemed to welcome visitors while simultaneously warning them of the power contained within these walls. Adrian waited at the palace steps, flanked by members of his court. He wore a black velvet coat with silver embroidery that caught the strange light of his realm. His silver eyes found Isabella immediately as her carriage came to a stop, and she felt that same electric awareness she had experienced during their first meeting. "Princess Isabella," he said, stepping forward to offer his hand as she descended from the carriage. His touch was cool but not uncomfortable, and she noticed that his strength was carefully controlled. "Welcome to Your Majesty," Isabella replied, executing a perfect curtsy despite the trembling in her legs. "I am honored to be here." Adrian's court watched the exchange with curiosity rather than hostility. Isabella recognized some faces from the negotiation meetings: Lord, the vampire diplomat who had helped draft the treaty, and Lady Nightshade, whose reputation as a warrior was legendary even among humans. "The ceremony will take place at sunset," Adrian explained as he guided Isabella toward the palace entrance. "Until then, you are welcome to rest and refresh yourself. Lady will show you to your chambers." The interior of palace was even more breathtaking than its exterior. Vaulted ceilings soared overhead, supported by columns that seemed to be carved from single pieces of dark marble. Tapestries depicting vampire history adorned the walls, their rich colors telling stories of battles won and kingdoms built. Crystal chandeliers provided warm light that eliminated the coldness often associated with stone structures. Isabella's chambers were luxurious beyond anything she had expected. The bedroom featured a massive four-poster bed draped in midnight blue silk, and tall windows offered views of the palace gardens. A sitting area with comfortable chairs surrounded a fireplace where flames danced without consuming any visible fuel. Vampire magic, Isabella realized. "Your belongings have been unpacked," Lady informed her. "A selection of gowns appropriate for tonight's ceremony awaits your approval. King Adrian wished to ensure you had choices that would make you feel beautiful and comfortable." Isabella examined the dresses with surprise. Each one was exquisite, crafted from the finest materials in styles that flattered her figure while maintaining the modesty expected of a princess. One gown in particular caught her attention, a creation of deep emerald silk that matched her eyes, with delicate silver embroidery along the bodice and sleeves. "King Adrian selected these himself?" Isabella asked. Lady nodded. "He has shown remarkable attention to detail regarding your comfort, Your Highness. This marriage may have begun as political necessity, but King Adrian has made it clear that he intends to treat you with the respect and care befitting a queen." As Isabella prepared for the ceremony, she found herself thinking about Adrian's behavior since her arrival. He had been courteous but distant, formal but not cold. She sensed a complexity in him that contradicted the savage monster portrayed in human stories about vampire kings. The wedding ceremony took place in its great hall as the sun set behind the mountains. The hall could have accommodated hundreds, but only essential members of both courts attended, along with Sir Thomas and a small delegation from Astoria. Vampire traditions required ceremonies to begin at sunset, when their power was strongest. Isabella wore the emerald gown, her hair arranged in an intricate style adorned with silver pins that caught the candlelight. As she walked down the aisle toward Adrian, who waited at an altar carved from black stone, she felt the weight of history on her shoulders. This marriage would either usher in a new era of peace or bind her forever to a man she barely knew. Adrian looked magnificent in formal vampire attire, a long black coat with silver fastenings over dark trousers and boots. His silver eyes never left her face as she approached, and Isabella thought she detected something softer than mere political calculation in his expression. The ceremony itself blended human and vampire traditions. A human priest from Astoria spoke the familiar vows of marriage, while a vampire elder performed rituals involving the exchange of silver rings inscribed with protective symbols. When Adrian placed the ring on Isabella's finger, she felt a strange warmth spread through her hand, as if the metal itself possessed some form of life. "With this union, let the war between our peoples end," declared Lord, holding aloft the peace treaty that both kings had signed. "Let this marriage be the foundation upon which our kingdoms build a future of cooperation and mutual respect." The moment felt surreal to Isabella. Months ago, she had been preparing for a completely different life, perhaps marriage to a human duke or prince, a future filled with familiar customs and expectations. Now she stood beside a vampire king in a realm of eternal twilight, bound to him by laws both human and supernatural. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Isabella had experienced. Vampire cuisine proved surprisingly delicate and flavorful, featuring dishes that incorporated ingredients she had never tasted. Musicians played instruments that produced haunting melodies, unlike human music, and the dancing that began after dinner moved with a grace that seemed to defy gravity. Adrian proved to be an excellent dancer, guiding Isabella through steps that felt natural despite their otherworldly quality. As they moved together, she began to see glimpses of the man beneath the crown and title. His touch was gentle, his conversation intelligent, and his attention to her comfort was genuine. "Are you frightened?" he asked during one particularly slow dance, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. Isabella considered lying, then decided on honesty. "Yes, but not in the way I expected to be." "What do you mean?" "I expected to fear for my life, for my safety. Instead, I find myself afraid of losing who I am in this new world." Adrian's expression grew thoughtful. "Identity is not something that can be taken from you, Princess. It can only be surrendered willingly. I hope, in time, you will find that becoming Queen of enhances who you are rather than diminishing it." The evening ended with Adrian escorting Isabella back to her chambers, which would remain hers alone until she felt comfortable sharing closer quarters. This consideration surprised her. She had expected vampire marriage customs to be less accommodating to human sensibilities. "Thank you," she said as they reached her door. "For the gowns, for the consideration, for making this day less frightening than it might have been." Adrian inclined his head formally. "You have sacrificed much for peace, Isabella. The least I can do is ensure that sacrifice is honored with respect." As Isabella prepared for bed in her new home, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. The war between humans and vampires was officially over, sealed by her marriage to a king who seemed far more complex than the stories had suggested. She was now queen of, bound to a realm of magic and mystery, wed to a man who controlled powers she could barely comprehend. Outside her windows, the vampire realm settled into its version of night. Strange lights flickered in the gardens, and she could hear the distant sound of fountains mixed with music that seemed to come from the very air itself. This was her home now, and Adrian was her husband. The treaty that ended a century of war lay somewhere in the palace archives, signed and sealed. Both kingdoms could now focus on rebuilding rather than destroying. Trade would flourish, families would be reunited, and children would grow up without fear of enemy armies. Isabella fell asleep that night wondering if she would ever truly belong in this mystical realm, not knowing that the greatest test of her new marriage was yet to come, and that the treaty she had helped create would soon face challenges that would force Adrian to make an impossible choice between duty to his kingdom and devotion to the woman who had captured his heart in ways he had never expected. 6 months had passed since Princess Isabella became queen of, and the vampire realm had transformed around her presence like a flower blooming in moonlight. What began as a political arrangement had evolved into something neither she nor Adrian had anticipated, a genuine partnership built on mutual respect, shared responsibilities, and growing affection that surprised them both with its intensity. Isabella had adapted to vampire court life with remarkable grace. She learned to navigate the complex social hierarchies of, where age and power determined status, and where centuries-old feuds required diplomatic finesse to manage. Her natural intelligence and compassion won over skeptical vampire nobles who had initially viewed her as nothing more than a human interloper in their ancient realm. Every morning, Isabella held court in the Crystal Chamber, a breathtaking room with walls made entirely of transparent stone that captured and reflected light in magical patterns. Here, she listened to petitions from both vampire and human subjects, as trade between the kingdoms had brought many humans to settle in its border towns. Her judgments were fair and thoughtful, earning her respect throughout the realm. Adrian watched his wife's transformation with amazement. The frightened princess who had arrived at his palace had become a confident queen who commanded attention in any room she entered. Her golden hair had grown longer, often adorned with the silver circlet that marked her royal status, and her emerald eyes had developed a depth that spoke of wisdom gained through experience. Their relationship had deepened gradually, built on evening conversations in Adrian's private study where they discussed kingdom affairs, philosophy, and their different perspectives on governance. Isabella brought fresh ideas about social welfare and education, while Adrian shared centuries of experience managing supernatural politics. They complemented each other in ways that made their rule stronger than either could have achieved alone. The physical attraction between them had grown as well, though both had been cautious about rushing into intimacy. Adrian's vampiric nature meant his strength and supernatural senses required careful control around his mortal wife. Isabella, raised in a sheltered human court, needed time to adjust to the reality of being married to someone whose very existence natural law. Their first real kiss had happened 3 months into their marriage, during a private dinner in Adrian's chambers. Isabella had been describing improvements she wanted to make to the palace gardens when she noticed Adrian watching her with an expression of such tenderness that her words trailed away. "What is it?" she had asked softly. "I was just thinking about how different you are from what I expected," Adrian replied, his silver eyes reflecting the candlelight. "I married you to secure peace, Isabella, but I find myself genuinely caring about your happiness." "I care about yours too," she had admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. "This marriage has become more real to me than I thought possible." When Adrian leaned across the small table to kiss her, Isabella felt a warmth spread through her entire body. His lips were cool but gentle, and she could sense the tremendous control he exercised to ensure she felt safe rather than overwhelmed by his supernatural nature. Now, 6 months later, they shared chambers as true husband and wife. Adrian had proven to be a considerate and passionate lover, always mindful of his strength, always putting Isabella's comfort above his own desires. Their intimacy had bridged the gap between human and vampire in ways that treaties and ceremonies never could. This morning found Isabella in the throne room, reviewing reports about increased trade revenues between Astoria and the peace treaty had brought unexpected prosperity to both kingdoms as merchants discovered the unique goods each realm produced. Human craftsmen prized vampire-made items enhanced with subtle magic, while vampires valued human artwork and literature that captured mortal perspectives on life and love. "Your Majesty," announced Lady, entering with her usual graceful urgency. "A delegation from the northern vampire clans has requested an audience. They claim to bring urgent news that affects the security of our realm." Isabella set aside her papers, immediately alert. The northern clans were ancient vampire houses that had remained independent of Adrian's rule, maintaining their own territories in the far reaches of the continent. Their relationship was cordial but distant, making this unexpected visit concerning. "Where is the king?" Isabella asked. "In the war room with Lord reviewing patrol reports from the eastern borders," Lady replied. "Shall I summon him?" "Yes, immediately, and prepare the formal audience chamber. If the northern clans have traveled this far south, their news must be significant." Adrian arrived within minutes, his expression grave. "The scouts reported seeing northern clan banners approaching our borders yesterday. I had hoped their visit would be routine, but their behavior suggests otherwise." The delegation that entered the audience chamber commanded respect through sheer presence alone. Led by Lady, matriarch of the clan and rumored to be over 800 years old, the group represented some of the most powerful independent vampire houses. Lady herself was striking, tall and elegant with silver-white hair that fell past her waist and eyes like polished obsidian. "King Adrian, Queen Isabella," Lady said, offering a bow that managed to be respectful while maintaining her obvious authority. "We thank you for receiving us on such short notice." "Lady," Adrian replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Your presence honors our court, what brings the northern clans south. Troubling developments that threaten not just our independence, but the stability of all vampire kind," Lady replied, her ancient voice carrying undercurrents of genuine concern. "The sect has risen again." Isabella felt Adrian tense beside her on their joint throne. She had learned enough vampire history to recognize the name. The sect was a fanatical group of vampires who believed their kind should dominate rather than coexist with humans. They had been dormant for decades, but their return would threaten everything the peace treaty represented. "Explain," Adrian commanded, his voice sharp with authority. Lord, another member of the delegation, stepped forward. 3 months ago, attacks began against human settlements near our territories. Villages burned, populations slaughtered or turned without consent. The attackers bore symbols and proclaimed their intention to restart the war between our peoples. The sect has gained considerable support among younger vampires who never experienced the true costs of the previous war, Lady continued. Their leader, a vampire called Nightfall, has united various rogue clans under his banner. He openly denounces your peace treaty as vampire weakness and calls your marriage to Queen Isabella an abomination that dilutes our pure bloodlines. Isabella felt cold dread settle in her stomach. The peace she and Adrian had worked so hard to maintain was under direct assault from vampires who viewed her very existence as an insult to their superiority. "How many follow this Nightfall?" Adrian asked, though Isabella could tell from his expression that he already feared the answer. "Our estimates suggest at least 15 independent clans have joined the sect," Lord replied grimly. "Perhaps 3,000 vampires, including many with considerable combat experience. They have established strongholds in the mountains and are actively recruiting more followers." "What do they want?" Isabella asked, surprising the delegation with her direct question. Some older vampires still struggled with the concept of a human queen having political authority. Lady turned her obsidian gaze toward Isabella with what might have been approval. "They demand the dissolution of your marriage, the cancellation of all peace treaties with human kingdoms, and a return to vampire supremacy over mortal populations. Nightfall has declared that he will not rest until what he calls the contamination of pure vampire rule has been eliminated." The implications were staggering. If the sect succeeded in their goals, it would mean not just the end of peace between humans and vampires, but Isabella's death and the destruction of everything she and Adrian had built together. "They have also made specific threats," Lord added reluctantly. "Nightfall has sworn to capture Queen Isabella and make an example of her. He claims that publicly executing the human queen will demonstrate vampire superiority and inspire other clans to abandon the peace treaty." Adrian's composure cracked slightly, his silver eyes flashing with dangerous intensity. "No one threatens my wife and expects to survive the experience." "King Adrian," Lady said carefully, "we bring this news not to alarm you unnecessarily, but because we believe the sect poses a threat to all of us. Your peace treaty has brought stability and prosperity. The northern clans have benefited from increased trade and reduced conflict with human territories. We have no desire to see those gains destroyed by fanatics." "What do you propose?" Isabella asked, recognizing that Lady was building toward a specific request. "An alliance," Lady replied. "The northern clans will stand with against the sect, but we require assurance that this conflict will not spill over into our territories or threaten our independence." Adrian considered this for several moments. "Your proposal has merit, but I need specifics. How many warriors can the northern clans provide? What guarantees do we have of your commitment? And what assurances do you require from?" The negotiations continued for hours, covering military logistics, supply lines, territorial boundaries, and rules of engagement. Isabella participated actively, her strategic mind helping to identify potential problems and solutions. She had learned that vampire politics required the same careful balance of threats and incentives as human diplomacy, just with higher stakes. By evening, they had reached an agreement. The northern clans would provide 2,000 experienced vampire warriors to help defend against the sect. In exchange, Adrian guaranteed that northern clan territories would remain autonomous and that any vampires captured during the conflict would be turned over to clan justice rather than its legal system. After the delegation departed to prepare their forces, Isabella and Adrian retreated to their private chambers to discuss the implications of this new threat. The cozy sitting area that had become their favorite place for evening conversations felt less secure now that they knew enemies were actively planning Isabella's capture and execution. "How real is this threat?" Isabella asked as Adrian poured wine for both of them, a human vintage that had become one of their shared pleasures. "Very real," Adrian replied grimly. "I knew Nightfall during my younger years, He was always ambitious and ruthless, but I thought his extremism would limit his influence. If he has managed to unite 15 clans under his leadership, he represents a genuine danger to everything we have built." Isabella sipped her wine thoughtfully. "What does this mean for the peace treaty with my father's kingdom?" "That depends on how the sect chooses to operate," Adrian said, settling beside her on the small sofa they had come to think of as theirs. "If they attack human settlements, King Edmund may feel compelled to mobilize his armies in defense. That could easily escalate into the very war we married to prevent." "And if they succeed in their primary goal?" Isabella asked quietly. "If they capture me?" Adrian's expression hardened. "They will not succeed. I will tear apart every vampire in their ranks before I allow harm to come to you." Isabella felt a warm surge of emotion at his fierce protectiveness, but she also recognized the dangerous implications of his statement. "Adrian, you cannot let protecting me lead you to actions that destroy the peace treaty. Too many lives depend on the stability we have created." "You are my wife, Isabella, my queen, my responsibility. Nothing matters more than your safety." "Your kingdom matters more," Isabella said firmly. "The thousands of humans and vampires who live in peace because of our marriage matter more. If protecting me means starting a war that kills innocent people, then we have failed in our purpose." Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his silver eyes reflecting the conflict between his personal feelings and his duties as a king. "How did you become so wise?" he finally asked. "I learned from watching you balance impossible choices every day," Isabella replied, moving closer to rest her head against his shoulder. "You have taught me that being a ruler means sometimes sacrificing what we want for what our people need." "What if what I need is you?" Adrian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I have discovered that I cannot imagine ruling this kingdom without you beside me?" Isabella looked up at him, seeing vulnerability in his expression that he rarely allowed anyone to witness. "Then we find a way to defeat the sect without compromising our principles or breaking our peace treaty. We prove that love can be stronger than hatred, that cooperation can triumph over fanaticism." Adrian kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and determination. "Together," he agreed. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Neither of them could have predicted the test that awaited their resolve, or the impossible choice that would soon force Adrian to decide between the treaty that brought peace to their kingdoms and the woman who had brought joy to his immortal heart. The sect was moving, their plans more cunning and ruthless than anyone suspected, and Isabella would soon find herself at the center of a conflict that threatened to unravel everything she and Adrian had worked to build. The trap had been perfectly orchestrated, and Isabella walked directly into it despite every precaution they had taken. It began with what appeared to be a routine diplomatic mission to the border town where human and vampire merchants had reported increasing tensions that threatened the profitable trade relationships established under the peace treaty. Isabella had insisted on handling the situation personally, believing that her presence would reassure both human and vampire residents that their concerns were taken seriously by the crown. Adrian had agreed reluctantly, sending her with an escort of 50 elite vampire guards commanded by Sir Stormwind, one of his most trusted knights. What none of them realized was that Nightfall had spent months infiltrating, placing his followers in key positions throughout the town. The reported tensions were manufactured crises designed to lure Isabella away from the heavily fortified security of Palace. The ambush came at sunset as Isabella's delegation prepared to return home after a successful day of negotiations. Sect vampires emerged from hidden positions throughout the town, their coordinated attack overwhelming Isabella's guards through sheer numbers and the element of surprise. Sir fought valiantly, his sword cutting through enemy ranks as he tried to reach his queen, but even his considerable skill could not overcome such overwhelming odds. Isabella found herself surrounded by hostile vampires, their eyes glowing red with bloodlust and fanaticism. At their head stood Nightfall himself, an imposing figure with long black hair and features that spoke of centuries of violence. His presence radiated menace in a way that made Isabella's human instincts scream warnings of mortal danger. "The human pretender who dares call herself Queen of Vampires," sneered, his voice carrying the arrogance of someone who believed himself divinely appointed to restore vampire supremacy. "Your reign of contamination ends tonight." "King Adrian will come for me," Isabella said, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "And when he does, you will face the full might of armies." Laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I am counting on it, little human. Your capture is only the beginning of my plan." They transported Isabella to an ancient fortress deep in the mountains, a stronghold that had been abandoned for centuries, until the sect claimed it as their base of operations. The fortress was a maze of stone corridors and chambers carved directly into the mountainside, designed by paranoid vampires who feared attack from both human armies and rival vampire clans. Isabella's cell was a small stone room with a single window too narrow for escape, though it offered a view of the treacherous mountain paths that would make any rescue attempt incredibly dangerous. The isolation was perhaps worse than the physical discomfort. She had grown accustomed to the constant activity of palace life, to having people she trusted nearby, to the reassuring presence of Adrian, who had become her anchor in the supernatural world of. Visited her regularly, not to torture her physically, but to engage in psychological warfare designed to break her spirit and turn her against Adrian. His strategy was more subtle and therefore more dangerous than simple brutality. "Do you know what your husband was before he met you?" asked during one of these visits, settling into a chair he had placed just outside her cell. Adrian was known as the Crimson King, feared throughout the vampire world for his ruthlessness in battle. He once destroyed an entire human city because its duke refused to pay tribute to vampire authority. "I do not believe you," Isabella replied, though doubts began creeping into her mind. Adrian had shared some of his history with her, but she knew there were centuries of experiences he had not discussed. "Belief is irrelevant when facts speak for themselves," continued smoothly. "Adrian married you not out of growing affection, but because he recognized that controlling a human queen would be more effective than ruling through fear alone. You are his puppet, Isabella, a beautiful symbol he uses to maintain power over both vampires and humans." "If that were true, why would you consider me such a threat?" Isabella countered, using logic to combat the seeds of doubt he was trying to plant. "A puppet would serve your purposes as well as his." His eyes flashed with irritation at her quick thinking. "Because your existence legitimizes the idea that vampires and humans can coexist as equals. That is a poison that weakens vampire superiority and must be eliminated before it spreads further." Meanwhile, Adrian was mobilizing every resource at his disposal to locate and rescue his wife. The moment Sir had staggered back to with news of Isabella's capture and the death of most of her guard, Adrian had transformed from a diplomatic ruler into the warrior king of vampire legend. War councils met around the clock in strategic planning chambers. Maps covered every surface as Adrian, Lord, Lady Nightshade, and the recently arrived lady worked to identify possible locations where the sect might be holding Isabella. "The mountains offer numerous defensible positions," Lady reported, her warrior's experience evident in her tactical analysis. "Would choose somewhere that allows him to see approaching forces while providing multiple escape routes." "Fortress," Lady said suddenly, her ancient knowledge proving invaluable. "It was abandoned after the plague of 1847, but the structure remains sound. The mountain paths are treacherous enough to slow any rescue attempt, and there are caves throughout the area that could hide additional forces." Adrian studied the detailed maps Lady produced from her extensive archives. How many soldiers would he need to hold such a position? Perhaps 200 for the fortress itself, but if he has positioned additional forces throughout the surrounding peaks, he could command the entire valley, Lord observed. "A direct assault would be costly and might fail." "Then we do not assault directly," Adrian replied, his silver eyes reflecting a dangerous determination. "We use strategy instead of brute force." The plan they developed was complex and risky. Adrian would lead a small force of elite vampires up the most dangerous mountain path, approaching fortress from the supposedly inaccessible northern face. Meanwhile, Lady would create a diversion by leading a larger force up the main approach, drawing attention and soldiers away from the fortress itself. The northern clan warriors provided crucial support, their knowledge of mountain warfare proving invaluable in planning routes and timing. Lady herself would coordinate communications between the different forces using ancient vampire magic that could carry messages across great distances. What none of them anticipated was, he had no intention of simply holding Isabella prisoner. His plan was far more devastating and personal than anyone had realized. On the third night of her captivity, Isabella was awakened by the sound of her cell door opening. Entered with several of his followers, their expressions grim with purpose. "Time for you to play your final role in this drama, human queen," announced. "Your husband approaches with his armies, just as I predicted. Now comes the moment when Adrian must choose between his precious peace treaty and your worthless mortal life." They brought Isabella to the fortress's highest tower, where a complex magical apparatus had been constructed. Isabella recognized some elements from her studies of vampire magic: binding circles, amplification crystals, and symbols of power that could channel supernatural energy across great distances. "What is this?" Isabella demanded, though she feared she already knew the answer. "A communication array that will allow me to speak directly to Adrian and the human king simultaneously," replied with evident satisfaction. "In moments, your husband will face an impossible choice. He can save you by abandoning his treaty with the humans and joining my cause, or he can maintain his precious peace while watching you die." "Adrian will never abandon the treaty," Isabella said firmly. "Too many lives depend on it." "We shall see," smiled coldly. "Love makes even the strongest rulers into fools." The magical array activated with a sound like thunder rolling through mountains. Suddenly, Adrian's voice filled the chamber, transmitted across the miles with crystal clarity. Nightfall, Adrian's voice carried controlled rage that made Evan's followers step back unconsciously. "Release my wife, and I might allow you to live long enough to face trial." "Ah, Adrian," replied, positioning Isabella where the magical viewing sphere would ensure Adrian could see her clearly. "Still playing the civilized king, I see. But tonight, we discover what matters more to you, your political treaties or your precious human bride." Isabella could see Adrian through the magical connection, standing in what appeared to be a military command center surrounded by his war council. His silver eyes found hers across the mystical link, and she saw love, fury, and desperate calculation warring in his expression. "Here are your choices, old friend," continued. "Renounce your peace treaty with the humans publicly. Declare that vampires are the superior species and that human-vampire cooperation was a mistake. Join my cause in establishing true vampire dominance over mortal populations. Do this, and I will release your queen unharmed." "And if I refuse?" Adrian asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Then you watch as I demonstrate what happens to humans who dare to claim equality with vampire royalty," replied, drawing a silver blade that gleamed with unnatural sharpness. "Isabella dies, her death becomes a symbol of vampire supremacy, and the war between our peoples resumes with greater fury than ever before." Through the magical connection, Isabella could see her father, King Edmund, had joined Adrian's council. The elderly human king looked haggard with worry and rage, his hands clenched into fists as he watched his daughter being threatened by the vampire extremist. "You have 1 hour to decide," announced. "Use the time wisely, Adrian. Consider what truly matters to you, political convenience or the woman you claim to love." The connection went silent, leaving Isabella alone with her captors in the tower chamber. She used the time to study the magical apparatus, looking for weaknesses that might be exploited. Her months as vampire queen had included basic education in supernatural arts, and she recognized that the communication array required constant energy to maintain its connections. An hour later, the array reactivated. Adrian appeared in the viewing sphere, his expression calm but his eyes burning with barely controlled emotion. "I have made my decision," Adrian announced, his voice carrying across the mountains with absolute authority. "Wise choice," said smugly. "The treaty renunciation." "Goes to hell along with you," Adrian replied coldly. Then, to Isabella's amazement and horror, he pulled out a copy of the peace treaty that had ended the century-long war between humans and vampires. "You want to know what matters more to me than political convenience. You want to see how much I value the woman I married." Adrian held the treaty document over a flame that appeared in his hand through vampire magic. "This treaty represents the end of war, the salvation of thousands of lives, the foundation of peace between our peoples." The parchment began to burn, its edges curling as centuries of diplomatic work turned to ash. "But Isabella is worth more than all of it." "Adrian, no," Isabella cried out, but her husband was not finished. "I renounce this treaty freely and publicly," Adrian declared, his voice carrying to both vampire and human witnesses. "I declare that peace built on threatening the innocent is no peace at all. The sect wants war. They shall have it, but not the war they expected." King Edmund stepped forward in the viewing sphere, his weathered face showing grief but understanding. "King Adrian, if you renounce the treaty to save my daughter, I cannot guarantee peace between our kingdoms." "I understand, your majesty," Adrian replied, "but I have learned that some things matter more than treaties. Some bonds are stronger than political convenience. Some loves are worth any sacrifice." The treaty finished burning, its ashes scattering in the magical flames. Watched with growing confusion as Adrian's actions deviated from his carefully planned script. "You have renounced the treaty," said slowly, "but you have not agreed to join my cause." "Because I am about to demonstrate the difference between sacrificing a treaty and sacrificing principles," Adrian replied. "I burned that document not to join you, but to prove that Isabella means more to me than any political arrangement. Now let me show you what happens when you threaten someone I love." The communication array exploded as Adrian channeled his full power through the magical connection. The backlash sent, and his followers staggering, their careful plans disrupted by magical feedback they had not anticipated. Isabella used the confusion to act on the weakness she had identified in the chamber's defenses. The binding circles that kept her restrained required specific geometric patterns to function. She had noticed that one of the amplification crystals was positioned incorrectly, probably damaged during the magical backlash. Moving with speed born of desperation, Isabella kicked the misaligned crystal out of position. The binding circles flickered and failed, freeing her from the supernatural restraints just as Adrian and his elite forces breached the tower chamber through windows that should have been impossible to reach. The battle that followed was brief but devastating. Adrian moved with the fluid grace of a vampire warrior king, his centuries of combat experience making him unstoppable in close quarters. Fought valiantly, but he was no match for Adrian's combination of skill, power, and absolute fury at seeing his wife threatened. "This is what happens when you mistake love for weakness," Adrian said as his blade found heart. "Isabella made me stronger, not weaker. Our bond gave me something worth fighting for beyond mere power." The rescue was complete, but the consequences of Adrian's actions rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. The peace treaty was broken, burned publicly before witnesses from both kingdoms. War seemed inevitable as human and vampire armies prepared for renewed conflict. But in the days that followed, something unexpected happened. The public renunciation of the treaty, motivated by love rather than political calculation, sparked conversations throughout both realms about the true foundations of peace. Adrian's willingness to sacrifice political stability for Isabella's safety demonstrated that their marriage was built on genuine devotion, not mere convenience. King Edmund, despite his initial anger at the treaty's destruction, found himself moved by Adrian's sacrifice. In a private meeting at the border between their kingdoms, the human king extended an unexpected offer. "You burned our treaty to save my daughter," King Edmund said to Adrian as they met on neutral ground. "But in doing so, you proved that your commitment to Isabella is absolute. Perhaps we can build something stronger than that document ever was." "What do you propose?" Adrian asked, Isabella standing beside him as they faced her father together. "A new treaty," King Edmund replied. "One based not on political necessity but on family bonds. You are my son-in-law now truly and completely. That makes you family, and family protects family." The new peace treaty that emerged from these negotiations was indeed stronger than its predecessor. Rather than being a cold, diplomatic document, it was built on personal relationships, mutual respect, and the demonstrated willingness of both leaders to sacrifice for those they loved. Isabella and Adrian returned to Palace as heroes who had proven that love could triumph over fanaticism, that personal bonds could be stronger than political convenience, and that sometimes the greatest act of faith was burning the old to make room for something better. The vampire realm celebrated their queen's safe return with festivals that lasted for days. The story of Adrian burning the treaty to prove his love for Isabella became legend throughout, inspiring countless romantic tales and proving that even immortal vampire kings could be transformed by love. As they stood together on their palace balcony, watching the celebrations in the gardens below, Isabella reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you regret burning the treaty?" she asked Adrian, leaning against his strong shoulder as they watched fireworks paint the twilight sky in brilliant colors. "Never," Adrian replied without hesitation. "That document was just parchment and ink. What we have built together, our love, our partnership, our commitment to both our peoples, that is worth more than any treaty ever signed. Even if it had cost us the peace between our kingdoms." Adrian turned to face her fully, his silver eyes reflecting the fireworks and something deeper. "Isabella, you taught me that peace without justice is meaningless, that treaties without heart are just temporary truces. When I burned that document, I was not destroying peace. I was proving that our love is strong enough to build something better." Isabella smiled, understanding finally that Adrian's dramatic gesture had not been about choosing her over duty, but about choosing a deeper truth over political convenience. Their love had indeed proven stronger than treaties, but only because it inspired them to create something more meaningful than either had imagined possible. The war between humans and vampires was truly over now, ended not by diplomacy, but by the demonstrated power of love to transform enemies into family, fear into trust, and political necessity into genuine partnership. The treaty Adrian burned had been replaced by bonds that could never be dissolved by flames or forgotten in archives. As Queen of, Isabella had found her purpose not just in ruling beside Adrian, but in proving that bridges between different worlds could be built on the foundation of authentic love rather than mere political convenience. Their story became legend, but more importantly, it became the cornerstone of lasting peace between two peoples who had forgotten they could be more than enemies. In the end, Adrian had kept both his wife and his principles, proving that sometimes the greatest act of faith was destroying the old to make room for something infinitely more valuable. The treaty burned, but from its ashes rose a bond between kingdoms that would endure for generations, built not on parchment, but on the unshakable foundation of true love freely given and fiercely protected.